Bom, boa tarde a todos. Estamos então dando início a mais um seminário no ciclo de seminários do Departamento de Estatística. E hoje nós estamos recebendo aqui a Esther Salazar, pesquisadora na área de estatística e que trabalha atualmente em Maryland, na FDA, na Food and Drug Administration, do governo dos Estados Unidos. A Esther, ela teve uma passagem pelo Brasil, especificamente no Rio de Janeiro, onde ela fez o mestrado e o doutorado dela em estatística na UFRJ. Ela também, depois do Rio de Janeiro, dessa passagem por ela acabou indo para os Estados Unidos, trabalhou como pós-doc lá, primeiro na Carolina do Norte, né, no SAMSE. Depois ela foi para Duke University, acabei encontrando com ela lá de novo, já que eu tinha conhecido a Esther na UFRJ, acabei encontrando com ela lá na Duke University, quando eu fazia o meu doutorado lá. Então ela trabalhou no Departamento de Engenharia Elétrica e Computação na Duke, como pós-doc, e depois também deu aulas lá, né, como docente. Então, desde fevereiro de 2015, ela está no FDA, e como área de pesquisa, ela se envolve em vários temas, como estatística bayesiana, modelagem de populações, dados de amostragem, bioestatística, saúde pública, modelos espaço-temporais, métodos não paramétricos, machine learning, uma série de áreas. A Esther vai fazer a apresentação dela em inglês, porém ela entende português muito bem, então quem quiser fazer perguntas para ela, vai digitar no chat aí, né? Pode fazer as perguntas, no final a gente abre para as perguntas, né? Mas pode escrever durante a apresentação, pode escrever em português, que ela vai poder responder tranquilamente, tá? Mas ela vai fazer a apresentação em inglês. Então, Esther, muito obrigado por ter aceito participar do nosso ciclo de seminários. É com você.
Obrigada, Vinícius. Você pode votar? Oh, ok.
Isso.
Bom, eu vou fazer uma breve introdução no português, eu vou tentar lembrar um pouquinho, faz muito tempo que eu não falo português, mas eu vou tentar agora. Muito obrigada pelo convite, Vinícius. Eu recebi com alegria o convite para falar desse trabalho que eu fiz há 4 anos atrás com o pessoal da Duke e tem outro pessoal também de outras universidades que tinham muito interesse na análise de dados, de diferentes tipos de dados. Eu vou falar aqui de um conjunto de aplicações que a gente trabalhou no passado e tem alguns artigos que eu vou fazer uma referência no final da apresentação, se vocês tiverem interesse na inferência dos modelos, em aplicações parecidas na aplicação que eu vou apresentar hoje. Pode passar no seguinte, eu acho que eu posso fazer isso, né? Seguinte slide. Tudo bem. Vou falar agora em inglês, vou tentar, porque as definições que eu trabalhei nesse trabalho, eu aprendi essas definições em inglês, então eu vou começar a falar em inglês agora. Vou fazer uma mistura de coisas aqui em inglês, português, vou tentar fazer direitinho. Então, let me start with this introduction. I will talk about background motivation of this analysis. Then I'm going to talk about the model, tô misturando tudo agora. The models for heterogeneous data. I'm going to continue talking about the model extensions, the inference procedure, and then the application to neuroscience data, and then conclusions. This is a problem that is very common in neuroscience data. The real problem is that we have multiple types of data. For example, we can have fMRI data, which is different types of measurements from brain activity. In this particular problem, we have 2 different measurements from fMRI data. The first one is measurements from amygdala. Amygdala is a part of the brain that will react for different reactions or different feelings of the person. And then we will have data for that specific area of the brain. We can also have data from this ventral striatum, reactivity to expressions, as I mentioned, similar to amygdala. So we will have data from those two different regions of the brain. This data generally is real value measurements, and then the goal is try to see if we can extract information from those sets of data sets. But also we can have data related to, for example, questionnaires. One example is a questionnaire that is related to behavioral items. So we can have also responses from participants related to behavioral and psychological aspects, and we can have multiple questions. But as you know, those questions are probably ordinal values or categorical values. I mean, we have different types of information from questionnaires, which is not same as fMRI data, but from the same people. So we can have a different type of data from self-report questionnaires. Another type of data is the single nucleotide polymorphism SNP data. And then this is also ordinal. I will talk a little bit about that type of data, but we can consider that data also as ordinal. This is related to DNA data, and we can also have information from participants about that type of data that we would like to include in a general model. Another thing is psychiatric scores. For example, internalizing scores related to depression, anxiety, or externalizing scores related to misbehavior, aggression, delinquency, and even other scores related to schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. So as you can see, we have multiple views that I will call in this presentation views that could be real value data sets or ordinal value data sets. So the goal is try to see if we can incorporate all of this data in a general model to learn features, to classify people, and to see if we can predict some of those values. So this is basically the problem here. Try to establish a model so we can learn from all these views to make some predictions and, of course, cluster participants. However, what is actually the real question in this specific problem, the neuroscience data? What are the questions that we would like to answer? For example, it is of interest to develop strategies to predict individual patterns of behaviorally and clinically relevant brain activity in the absence of direct neuroscience measurement. What this means is that, for example, fMRI is a very expensive. It's very expensive. I mean, it's very expensive to get information from fMRI data. Or if there is a problem with the machine and you only have data from this other type of data, is it possible to predict the fMRI data from the other sources, from the other views? Is that possible? Which is the question, the first question highlighted in blue. Can one predict neural biomarkers measured from fMRI based on information derived from, for example, self-report questionnaires, or even from genetic data, the SNP data? In the other direction, can one predict an individual's fundamental propensity to psychopathologically based on observed self-report questionnaires, SNP, and fMRI? This is related to the psychiatric scores. For example, if we have other types of data, and then we can learn from these other data sets, and can we predict those scores using other views? So this is actually the questions that we would like to address in this analysis. What is the research idea here? Is to try to use all this multi-view data to fit a model that we will call a flexible model for heterogeneous multi-view data. where we can consider, for example, real valued views. In taking this as an example, that will be fMRI responses and psychiatric scores, and also to consider ordinal value responses that could be answers to questionnaires, different type of questionnaires. So the idea is to combine those and try to infer relationships to cluster people and to predict missing data from those data sets. So let's start talking about this model. So let's assume that we have capital N people, and then also assume that we have capital M views. In this neuroscience example, I will say we have 4 different views, right? One for the fMRI, another for the psychiatric scores, another for the DNA SNP data, and the other one is for the questionnaires. So then let's assume also that we will have the first capital M1 views as real value matrices that I'm going to introduce as YM, M going from M to capital M1. And then we have other matrices that are ordinal value matrices, M2. And then the idea is try to establish a link function for this in case these data sets are, for example, ordinal values. We can establish a link function and we can, for example, consider a probit link function for that. And in case these matrices are real value matrices, this link function is just identity link function. So then let me go to the previous slide. So then the idea is try to establish, as I mentioned, a link function for that, and then try to establish a model for capital X M. M is the index for each of the views that we can define in the model. So the model is basically a factor model, or it could be a regression model that I'm going to discuss in a minute. So this matrix X, in the rows we will have n rows that each row represents a person, and in the columns we will have the different items that comes from with the information from each of the views. And the idea is try to decompose this matrix X for each of the views into 2 components. The first component is VM, which is, I would say, the loading matrices following the notation and following definitions from factor models. And then we will have the WM, which is the factors, and plus an error term. So this XM, as I mentioned, because we are using a link function, is just a real value matrix. We are not dealing with other values anymore because of the probit link function that we used in the previous step. And then we can define priors or assumptions for each of those components in this model, for V and for WM. So let's assume, for example, that for each of the rows of VM and WM, we can assume that each of those rows follow a normal distribution with median VI, I representing each of the rows. And then this component, which is the variance for this each of the rows, tau M minus 1, and multiplied by the identity matrix, because this is a vector. And also for the factors, we are assuming alpha MK minus 1, the precision for these factors multiplied by identity matrix. And for each of those components, for example, for the median of VI, we are assuming just a normal distribution as a prior for this component with zero mean and identity matrix for the variance. And then we are assuming additional priors for the other components in this model. For tau, we are assuming a gamma distribution, and also for alpha mk, we are assuming another gamma distribution. One important characteristic of this model is that if we assume that, for example, tau m goes to infinity for all of the views, then the model reduces to the simpler model for which all the factor scores are the same for all m views. This is actually a simplification of this factor model where we are assuming factor loadings, common factor loadings for each of the views. But in this case, we would like to make this model very flexible. So we will have different factor loadings for each of the views. And then that will help us also for classification purposes and also to learn correlations between the views, as I'm going to explain in a minute. Another important thing, because we are dealing with factor models, is that the idea is also to reduce the dimensionality of the problem. For example, if we have multiple items, that is the sum of the number of the columns for each of those matrix X, that will be the sum of PM. Then the idea is try to reduce the dimensionality of this problem, assuming that we are learning only from capital K factors, where capital K is much, much lower than the number of columns in this problem, or the number of items in this problem, so, which is one of the characteristics of factor model, dimension reduction problem. So just giving a little more of notation, we were discussing about the matrix X, right, which is the representation after the link function, because our original values are y, m. So then we can rewrite this model as V times W tilde here for each of the views. And this is only the same representation, but assuming that we are considering this term here, which is the root square of 1 plus tau m minus 1. And this is a very interesting representation because that will give us interpretation for each of those components. For example, wk tilde m, we can write the prior for this component as a normal distribution with zero mean, and then with this precision term here. And this is actually a very interesting number because that will indicate how active is that factor, that K factor in each of the views, in each of the M views. And that will help us also for to see which factors are relevant for each views, and also to help us to compute correlations to see which items in each of the views are correlated with other views as well. Regarding correlation between views, for example, views M and view M and view M prime, we can compute those view-specific factor loading matrices, omega tilde M, for each of the views, and then compute the view correlation matrix using this formula. I'm not going to give more details about that, but this is a representation that we can derive easily from this model. And we also have some measurements here that shows how to compute each of the elements for this. Again, these correlations between views are useful for interpretation purposes, and I will show some results using the neuroscience data that I explained at the very beginning of this presentation. Identifiability of factor models actually is a big problem, right? We always have issues with that. The factors are not necessarily the same if we run the models many times, so we need to deal with this problem. In this specific model approach, we use some strategies using some ideas proposed in these papers that I'm highlighting here. And then we are using some machine learning techniques, actually, from using parameter expanded variational based. I'm not going to give too much detail about that strategy, but I'm just putting this slide here for you to know that this modeling approach is dealing with this identifiability problem. And actually, the main strategy here is optimize this rotation matrix Q to maintain the identifiability of the model and achieve faster convergence during inference. If you would like to see more details of this framework, please take a look at these papers that I'm putting here as our references. I was discussing also that this model will help us with for interpretation purposes and also for clustering. For example, we can use this model and adapt this framework for multi-view clustering. For example, if we would like to cluster people, how we can do that? How we can cluster people only using one view or using a combination of all views? Because we are dealing with a factor model, we are reducing the dimensionality of this problem. We are going to use the latent factors V as a measurement to cluster people. And then we're going to generate or we're going to establish a Gaussian mixture model with J components. Capital J actually is the maximum number of clusters for this specific example. And we are considering that each of these elements of matrix V, for the latent factors, can be modeled as using this approach. Actually, this is just a representation of a Gaussian mixture model, and we are using this strategy to cluster people and to cluster to cluster people. So this is, I'm not going to give more detail of this approach, but basically we use a Gaussian mixture model with a capital J component, which is the number of clusters in this problem, to do that. In the very beginning of this motivation example, I was talking about prediction. I was talking about prediction because this is actually something that psychiatrists and people from neuroscience at Duke actually were discussing a lot. How we can use other data sources to predict fMRI data. Not to predict the whole fMRI data, but to predict, for example, regions where we have problems or we will have missing data, and how we can use other views to do that. So this is actually one thing that we approach in this modeling framework, and this is what I'm going to discuss now in this slide. So then this model was actually adapted to do this type of predictions, and we incorporate an additional component in the model, which is a regression component. Remember that in the very beginning of the slides, I have a model for each of the rows for the matrix X, right, which is the latent or auxiliary observations after the link function. So for each of them, I only have this component, which is the factor and the factor loadings, and then the variance component. But then we also explore adding this regression component into the model. So we can add covariates to help us to predict some of the real values or components of this vector xi for each of the views. So then the idea is for this specific neuroscience problem to predict these 3 psychiatric scores defined as response variable, but also try to predict the fMRI readings for the amygdala and for the VS data. I will show some results related to that. But the basic idea is introducing an additional component in the mean of this normal distribution, which is a regression component. As you can see, if we have, for example, m equal to 4 views represented in this diagram, we will have 4 matrices, and then we will have the same number of factors, and then we will add an additional block, which is the factor loadings for the additional, for the component that we are interested in predicting. And then we are going to have also a regression component for this model. And then we can predict actually those real values using this approach and adding the regression component. How we can make inference for this problem? I didn't actually mention the first part, the logit link function. Actually, I didn't put details in this slide, but let me just verbally mention that to you. Since we are using a link function, a logic link function to try to estimate latent numbers, right, for x when we have ordinal values, we also use variational Bayesian EM inference to do that. I mean, to learn from the cut points, to learn from these latent values, to transform these ordinal values to real values. And then when we have that, then we can proceed with the modeling framework that I was explaining to you, which is the factor model plus the regression component. If we have that, then we can use, actually we use variational based EM inference strategies to learn from all the parameters, the unknown parameters. So we infer the factor loadings, we infer the factors itself, we also infer the precision matrix using that strategy. So in the end, we infer the variational distribution for those latent variables, collectively refer in this slide as theta. And for, as I mentioned, for the loadings, for the factors, and also for the index, if we use a mixture Gaussian model for clustering. And then we use the mean field approximation, try to approximate the posterior distribution of those values using this representation, and then use the variational based EM approach. If you are interested in looking at those formulas and more details about how we perform this inference, please take a look in the last slide. I put some references. In those papers you can find all the details related to how we put these formulas for variational EM, and also to learn how to infer the cut points for the logic model. So let me now start talking about the application, which is a very interesting application, and see how we can cluster people and infer fMRI and psychiatric scores. Let me continue talking about this data, which is very interesting data and very challenging problem. So we apply this multi-view factor modeling approach, the approach that I just described, on this neuroscience data. And the goal, as I mentioned, is interpret the common views as latent factors, and also try to see if we can learn the correlations between all these views. Also to predict missing data for some views, for example, fMRI responses. As I mentioned, fMRI, to get fMRI data is very expensive, so people are very interested in seeing if we can use modeling strategies to predict those fMRI responses, and also psychiatric scores. And finally, to cluster people, because they also would like to classify people that maybe are more like with psychological features, like with depression or anxiety, so they can like assign treatments to them. The data that we have been considering for this application is this heterogeneous multi-view data from over 600 college students. And we consider for this specific application 15 views. The first M1 views, I mean, as I mentioned to you, those are the ordinal value matrices, were defined as the first ordinal value response is from a questionnaire. This NEO-PIR questionnaire is actually a psychological questionnaire, which is a very big questionnaire with more than 200 questions related to different personality. For example, related to how the person feel about a specific situation, extroversion, things like that. So this is like a very interesting questionnaire, and that questionnaire by itself actually provide us a lot of interesting results in terms of clustering and cluster people to receive psychological treatments. But people are very interested in looking at a combination of different data sources that could help us to better classify people using other data sources. So that's why we also consider the SNP data, which is this data from DNA, which is also ordinal value data. And we consider this as additional 3 ordinal values views because we collect this SNP data from 3 different systems. I'm not like a person that knows a lot of biology, but I will just mention that those are the 3 systems that we consider, and we consider those as ordinal views as well. The other real value views comes from the fMRI data. We consider actually 8 additional real value matrices that are from the amygdala reactivity. As I mentioned, this is part of the brain. And then we have measurements related to the left and right amygdala reactivity to different stimuli. For example, anger, fear, neutral and surprise stimuli, or images that shows to the participants. And additional 2 real value views from left and right ventral striatum from the brain as well. And finally, 1 additional view that comes from the psychiatric scores. For the regression model, we only consider gender. We have other covariates to include in the regression component, but in the end, we just saw that those covariates were not meaningful for this application. So in the end, we just consider gender as a covariate in the regression component. So for the ordinal views, also we consider, of course, the NEO questionnaire, right? As I mentioned to you, over 200 items or questionnaires that we have data from those. But for the ordinal views, as I mentioned, we have from the three different systems. And for each of them, actually, we have over 700 SNPs columns, right, for this first system. For the other 800, and for the other also more than 1,000 items for that genetic data. And each of these data, why this is ordinal? Because just to give some background on these genotype sequences, we can, they put the values of these SNP data as 1, 2, or 3, 1 being this representation, and so on. So this is just a brief explanation why we consider these SNP data as ordinal views. And then we will use a probit link function for that specific view, for the SNP data view. We also have these real value views from fMRI. As I mentioned, we have 8 views from amygdala, here in this plot, we have on the left the amygdala in the brain. For example, this is just the behind of our head, and then this is the left amygdala, where the amygdala is located in the brain. So we have values for this region, and then we have for this region different voxels. And for each of those voxels, we have a measurement, a real value measurement. And we have, of course, for the left and for the right amygdala. This is for the left. And we have for each of them 4 different values, because this is a reaction of different stimuli. As I mentioned, for example, for anger, the participant receive a stimuli looking at a picture with a face, anger face, or fear, or neutral, or surprise. And then we have those measurements. So we have a lot of data from the left and right amygdala. In total, 8 views from amygdala. And the same from ventral striatum. We also have, for the left and right, we have 301 voxels and over 200 voxels for the right BS region of this. I mean, in this picture, I'm also showing the location of the ventral striatum, which is a little bit, above the amygdala. So we have 2 different regions in the brain for these 2 different, 10 real value views for this specific problem. And for the psychiatric scores, I put here a footnote with more information about these psychiatric scores. And basically, we focus on 3 different psychiatric scores. The first one is the thought disorder, which is basically related to a score for disturbance in one's ability to generate a logical sequence of ideas, and is also related to schizophrenia or some related psychotic disorders. And the other one is internalizing, which is related to anxious and depression symptoms, and externalizing, which is related to aggressive, delinquent, also alcohol or drug use disorders. So the idea is also try to see if we can predict, we can use this model to predict those psychiatric scores. So let me now talk about the results of this model. So the idea, as I mentioned, is try to see if we can use this factor model to learn to reduce the dimensionality of the problem, right? And also to see if we can interpret the meaning of each of those factors, and then try to see if we can use that to classify people, to cluster people. In this specific application, we consider a maximum of 25 factors, and we order those in terms of the activeness of those factors in each of the views. For example, here we can see that the higher, the darkness of these boxes, right, represent the activeness of those of each of those factors in each of the views. For example, for the first factor, we can see that we have more influence for the Neo personality questionnaire, and also for the genetic data, the SNP data. And for others, we have more information related to the amygdala, and for others, we have more information related to BS, and so on. So we actually, in the end, we just for interpretation purposes, we saw that the first 7 factors were the most meaningful factors. And I forgot to put here a matrix that relates to the contribution, the variance contribution of those factors into the whole multi-view model. But basically, the first 7 factors sorry, are more meaningful for this application. The other beauty of this model is trying to infer the correlations between the views. For example, in this left-hand side of this slide, I'm showing the correlations for this for each of these views, and for example, we can see that, for example, for the neo components, right? Then now I have the labels to help me remember the meaning of those. For example, the neo is related to neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. So those are the factors that we also learn from these factor loadings. And I'm showing here the view correlation matrix in this left figure. We saw that, for example, these color labels here represents the NEO questionnaire. We also have the other views related to the SNP data. We also have values related to the fMRI data, and also for the psychiatric scores. And we can see here the correlations between all the views. For example, these ones are very shows a higher correlation for between the NEO questionnaires and also with the psychiatric scores. And we can actually interpret those as correlation between the views, and how we can use that to cluster people based on these correlations. We also have graph representation for this correlation matrix, which was very useful actually for psychiatric related people that they would like to, for example, see if the psychiatric scores represented here for these yellow circles are very related to, for example, these neutral for the fMRI data. For the fMRI data, and also for the ventral stratum is very related to the SNP data, because we have we can see here a connection between these two nodes. And of course, the NEO are like intercorrelated because it's related to personality. But this plot was very useful for psychiatrics to see which views are and which items are very correlated between the views, and then they extract useful information for research purposes. Another thing that we can do with these model outputs is cluster people using the mixture model that I explained a few minutes ago. So we are able to classify people and to see what are the characteristics of these people. For the over 600 students that we analyzed in this study, we were able to classify them into 5 clusters. And as you can see, each of the nodes here represent one participant. And then it was very interesting to see the common features between these students, and to classify people for treatment, because that was the purpose of this analysis, to see if we can classify people to offer to the participants or to offer to the patients specific treatments for psychological disorders or alcohol, drug use, and things like that. So that was also a very interesting output from the model, and help people to decide which treatment is better. It's much better for specific characteristics, psychiatric characteristics from the participants. Here I have the average of the psychiatric scores by cluster. For example, I have here for the 3 scores. Actually, there is an additional one that I didn't explain, but this is just let's just look at these 3 numbers, three different groups here, which is for the 3 psychiatric scores. We can see that for cluster 5, we have the higher scores, and actually this is the cluster that requires more attention from psychologists, because this is the people who has more problems, psychiatric problems and psychological problems. So those are considering high risk people to receive treatments, and this is just a representation of how we are looking at those on each of those clusters for treatment purposes. For example, this is a very interesting output for them to decide which cluster they will need to focus on, and to see which people they could identify for them to receive treatment. What about the predictions then related to, for example, fMRI data? As I mentioned, fMRI data, getting the fMRI data is very expensive. So then we can use this model also to try to predict those numbers, especially for missing values, or just for one person that maybe we don't have fMRI data at all. And then we can use the other views to learn, right, from, or to predict those values. So what we use here is just, we just use these 2 measurements to see which, to represent the root mean square error, and also to the coefficient of determination. And those are the formulas that we use to do that. And then we are just like trying to see what are the numbers, right, related to the predictions associated with all these fMRI views, right? As I mentioned, we have in total 10 views related to fMRI activity. And then here I'm showing the R square, and also the root mean square error related to the predictions for those. The R square range from 0 to 1. So we look at this NEO plus SNP data. Using only the questionnaires, the NEO questionnaire and the SNP data, and see how the R square looks like, and also only using the NEO questionnaire. So we use actually different experiments to do that. And then we can see that using more views, NEO plus SNP data, give us the better, higher coefficient of determinations, showing that if we use more views, we can increase, we can have more better results, right, to predict the fMRI reactivity, and also lower root mean square error if we consider more views, right, to do those predictions. This is just a graphical representation of the amygdala, the left and right amygdala, using predictions. Actually, what we did was to remove data, right, from some of the participants, and then predict that. This is just a representation of our predictions. I'm not showing here the real values, but let's see how the root mean square error looks like if we show that. Let me see here. Okay, this is the absolute error. We have values here that varies from 0 to 18, and then you can see here that the real values, the real values varies from, like, let's say 10 to 100 or 120. So then the errors are vary from 0 to 18, right? So then those are the representations of those predictions for left and right amygdala. And actually, this is specifically related to the stimuli for fear. And this is another example of the predictions, but not for amygdala. This is for ventral striatum. And the values vary from 0 to 40, and those are the real values. But then the absolute errors varies from 0 to 8, something like that. Just to mention, because this is a very interesting plot, this big picture is just a representation of the left and right VS, and this pointer here is just like give us the representation in a different direction, right, of the brain. Just for you to know. And in terms of prediction of psychiatric scores, we also ran the model considering different views. For example, using all the views, the NEO views, the fMRI, the SNP data, only NEO and fMRI, only NEO, only fMRI, and also use other regression strategies, for example, ridge regression, lasso regression. And this is the coefficient of determination using the same formulas that I already described for the R square. As you can see, if we use more views, right, the R squares are better, are higher, are close to 1. But if we compare with the other scenarios using only 2 views or only using 1 view or just ridge regression or lasso regression, I mean, the results are okay, but not as well as using all the views as we did in our proposed framework. Also, for the root mean square error, I mean, this is actually expected, right? Because the R squares are better considering all the views. We also see the root mean square errors are lower for the full model, considering all the views. Here in these blue bars. Conclusions. So this is just an example of an approach to combine data from multiple views. In this case, specifically, we consider views from real value data and from ordinal value data, and to use a factor model, right, to try to predict clinical relevant brain activity, or, for example, psychiatric scores. And the idea was to use all the information available for prediction purposes and for clustering also. A key component of our model is the development of this new framework for jointly learning from all these heterogeneous data. And also, we learned that self-report questionnaire data can be used to help predict biomarker data. Because I mean, this is one thing that the psychologists were like discussing with us. If we can use the NEO questionnaire, that is very rich, as I mentioned, more than 200 questions, to also help us predict biomarker data in the absence of direct measurements of brain activity, such as fMRI data from amygdala and from BS regions. I didn't spend too much time talking about the inference procedures that we use for this, but please, if you have time and if you are interested in this work, please take a look at these references, and you will find different strategies and a lot of information about the formulas that we use and the strategies, the inference strategies that we use, the prior information, values that we use to as prior distributions and everything related to inference in those papers. We have different strategies here, but basically the idea is kind of the same, which is the issue of combining different heterogeneous data for clustering and for prediction purposes. Well, this is all I have. If we have time, maybe we can like answer some questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Obrigado, Esther. Muito obrigado pela sua apresentação, foi muito clara. Tem alguns comentários aqui de alguém conhecido por você, vou colocar aqui na tela, né? professor Dani. Primeiro, indicando aí excelente palestra, muito orgulho e muita saudade. Parabéns, Esther. E aí ele fez uma perguntinha aqui, está na tela aí para você dar uma olhada. Ó. Então, não seria possível, ou mesmo melhor, aplicar a transformação nas médias, ao invés de aplicar nas respostas?
Essa é uma extensão do modelo. É uma extensão do modelo, a gente tentou fazer isso também, mas a gente tinha tudo pronto para fazer aquilo que eu já falei, né? Não fazer diretamente, a fazer uma transformação, mas não na forma como o Dani falou aqui. Mas isso é possível, a gente pensou isso também, mas a gente não tentou para esse específico, para esse exemplo que eu mostrei aqui, mas isso é possível sim, e tem pessoas que estão tentando fazer isso também.
Ele colocou mais uma pergunta aqui, ó. Como você compararia o Variational Base com o Full Base? Sei que é mais rápido, mas você recomendaria? Os erros de aproximação são desprezíveis ou o tempo de processamento é menor?
É uma excelente pergunta. Na verdade, a gente tentou fazer um Full Base Inference, mas você sabe que o processamento é bem maior, né? E a gente tinha problema a gente tinha um problema muito grande. A gente tinha muito dado de fMRI, e também os dados de SNP data. A gente tinha esse problema de big data. Então, uma só rodada era 1 minuto, 2 minutos, era muito demorado. Então, a gente tentou outras formas de fazer a inferência. Então, a gente tinha nessa época, os coautores tinham muita experiência fazendo o variational base. Então, a gente tinha a facilidade de rodar múltiplos cenários, a gente tinha a facilidade também de fazer diretamente inferência com o modelo logístico, que também é uma inferência difícil. Aliás, tem um artigo bem interessante que eu vou fazer uma propaganda aqui da professora Kelly, da UFRJ, né, que eles estão trabalhando junto com o professor João. Eles estão trabalhando também em inferência para o modelo logístico, né, ou PROVIT, para dados ordinais. Então, eu fiquei bem interessada nessa abordagem deles de fazer essa inferência, e até fiquei pensando que a gente poderia utilizar esse tipo de metodologia para fazer inferência também. A gente não tentou, mas basicamente a resposta é porque o processamento da inferência, o tempo computacional é bem menor. Mas tem os prós e contras, né, para fazer o variational base. Eu gostei da metodologia, mas eu ainda tenho essa preocupação de comparar os erros, ter esse problema de, por exemplo, da bimodalidade da distribuição a posteriori, esse tipo de coisa. Mas para esse específico exemplo, a gente não teve muito problema, não, utilizando o variational base.
Ok. Bom, agora, uma pergunta que eu fiquei curioso ao longo da sua apresentação, acho que foi lá no slide 9, quando você falou da sua estratégia para a identificação do modelo, né? Para tratar a identificabilidade. Que aí você mencionou que você tem uma matriz lá de rotação, né? E que você faz um processo de otimização.
Sim.
Aí eu fiquei só curioso no sentido assim, esse processo de otimização é demorado, é algo que é simples de ser feito, pensando mais na questão computacional, porque vocês já tinham todo esse problema computacional por conta do tamanho dos dados, né? E aí para resolver a questão da identificabilidade também tem esse passo, né? de definir essa Q aí.
É verdade. Na verdade, a gente utilizou essas abordagens que eu coloquei aqui na anotação, nesse slide aqui, esses artigos, ah, tem uma abordagem bem estabelecida para esse tipo de problema. Então, a gente, isso aqui é chamado o parâmetro Expanded Variational Base. O pessoal utilizou essa abordagem. Na verdade, eu não estou lembrando aí agora os detalhes dessa abordagem, mas eu vou fazer essa referência aqui nesses artigos para a gente dar uma olhada neles, porque,
Uhum.
sim, para te dar uma resposta agora do que a gente fez exatamente para essa abordagem, eu não estou me lembrando muito bem. Mas você pode
Uhum.
encontrar mais detalhes dessa abordagem do Parameter Expanded Variational Base para esse específico problema da rotação da matriz Q nesses artigos.
Uhum. E aí você mencionou lá nas suas aplicações a questão de fazer os clusters no caso, os indivíduos, né, as pessoas. E aí você mostrou lá que eram 5 clusters. Eu só não ficou claro para mim como que você definiu que eram 5. Por que esse número 5? Como que você chegou em 5?
Ah, uma excelente pergunta também. Na verdade, a gente fixou o número de clusters. Isso esse modelo aqui tem muito parâmetro, tem muita coisa, né? Eu até lembro na minha tese de doutorado, a gente trabalhou bastante para tentar, por exemplo, a fazer inferência do número de fatores, fazer inferência no número de grupos que a gente pode inferir desses dados aqui. Como a gente tinha muito parâmetro para fazer inferência, a gente fixou esse número de clusters. Eu acho que aqui é o capital J, que é o número de componentes no modelo de misturas, né, gaussiano. Então, a gente fixou isso aí em 5 clusters. Até a gente pediu a informação dos psiquiatras, do pessoal da neuroscience, do grupo, para a gente ter uma ideia de qual seria o número de clusters, ou até uma decision making, né, por exemplo, quantos grupos eles gostariam de ter para brindar tratamento psiquiátrico nessas pessoas, né? Então, isso aí a gente fixou, a gente definiu isso como sendo máximo 5, e a gente até, se eu me lembro bem, a gente tentou até 10 clusters, mas tinha ocasiões em que a gente tinha, por exemplo, 5 pessoas só, um cluster. Então, isso é uma indicação de que a gente tinha demais, de clusters demais. Então, a gente ia diminuindo o número de clusters e a gente chegou nessa quantidade, mas isso não é parte da inferência, a gente fixou isso.
Ok, entendi. E a minha última pergunta é a respeito da quantidade de fatores. Você chegou a mencionar na aplicação lá que tinha, acho que 25 fatores.
25, isso.
Também é algo fixado que vocês definiram?
A gente fixou o número de fatores, a gente tentou também 30, 40 fatores, porque a gente tinha essa flexibilidade de usar o variational base, não era muito
Uhum.
demorado essa abordagem. Mas uma coisa que a gente utilizou, e não é inferência, é mais analisar a interpretação das cargas dos fatores. A gente tinha uma ideia da contribuição dos fatores no modelo. Então, a gente tinha, por exemplo, eu até mencionei 7 fatores que eram bem importantes, né, para fazer o cluster das pessoas. Então, a gente utilizou 25, mas, na verdade, só 7 ou 10 fatores eram bem importantes. Então, a gente também não tem uma estratégia para fazer uma maneira de fazer inferência no número de fatores, mas a gente tinha essa indicação olhando para os resultados dos fatores, das cargas dos fatores no modelo fatorial, para ter uma ideia dos fatores que a gente tinha que rodar no mínimo, ou especificar no mínimo para rodar o problema, o modelo de novo, né? Então, a gente tinha essa indicação, mas isso é bem subjetivo, não é através de inferência.
Ok. Então, agora no chat aqui não tem mais perguntas, então acho que a gente já pode encerrar. Gostaria de agradecer muito a Esther por ter aceito participar do nosso ciclo aqui no Departamento de Estatística da UFMG. Então, Esther, muito obrigado, e na semana que vem a gente volta com mais um seminário. Aí, Esther, vou pedir para você ficar mais um pouquinho aí enquanto eu encerro aqui a transmissão. Ok? Muito obrigado.
Obrigada.